This video provides an introduction to cells and points out some of the key cell processes and structures that we'll be learning about this year. I want to start by talking about the basic principles of cell theory. As you already know from our discussion of characteristics of life, cells are the basic unit of life. Everything that's alive is made of cells. If something doesn't have cells, it's not living. If you only have one cell, that organism is known as unicellular, or possibly single-celled organism. You do hear both terms being used. And if that organism, that living thing, is made up of more than one cell, we call it multicellular. And then cells themselves are always, new cells are always being produced from other living cells. So you can't create something alive out of something that's dead. If a cell is alive, whatever it came from must have been alive as well. Individual cells can come in various sizes. We see cells ranging in size from as small as 0.2 of a micrometer. And remember, there are 1,000 micrometers in a millimeter, and a millimeter is the smallest measurement we see on our metric ruler. So 0.2 of a micrometer is how large bacteria are just in general. You can see those through the light microscope, but they really just look like a dirty slide. They're very, very small, and you need an electron microscope that can make it, large enough to actually see anything. But there are other cells that are many meters long. There are some nerve cells that are really very long. The sciatic nerve in your body, you may be aware, goes down the back of your leg, down to your toes. Sometimes people have sciatic pain, and that is all one cell. It's actually kind of part of one cell. The cell is buried in your spinal cord, and then it has a long extension called an axon that travels down to your big toe. And so, of course, your leg is quite long, and so that's going to be a very long cell. And other mammals that have even longer legs, like a giraffe, will have even longer nerve cells. Cells themselves can be organized, as we talked about in the characteristics of life discussion. And so a group of cells that have a similar function are a tissue, and then tissues can be organized into organs or organ systems, eventually to that organism. Cells can also be divided into two main types. They are either prokaryotic cells or eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells have their DNA piled together kind of like a plate of spaghetti in something we call a nucleoid. Prokaryotic cells also do not have really any distinct organelles except for ribosomes, so you can't see much inside them, as this picture is trying to give you an illustration, or this diagram is trying to show you. It just doesn't look very interesting in there, but they are alive, and so they are doing all of the functions necessary for life inside that cell. Prokaryotic cells also are only unicellular organisms. We don't know of any organism that is prokaryotic that is more than one cell. And we find our prokaryotic cells in the eubacteria and archaeobacteria kingdoms. So bacteria are an example of prokaryotic cell. All the other living things that you are familiar with are in the eukaryotic cell category. And in eukaryotic cells, the DNA is held in a nucleus, something you're probably quite familiar with. And there are many other organelles, distinct structures inside the cell, which are wrapped up by a membrane. So you can see some of those organelles being illustrated in the diagram for our eukaryotic cell. Eukaryotic cells make up unicellular and multicellular organisms, so most of the things that you know of as a living thing is going to be a eukaryotic, or made up of eukaryotic cells, or it'll be a eukaryote. And that includes things like fungus and plants and animals and the little single-cell organisms that live in pond water like amoeba or paramecium. Now, it doesn't matter whether a cell is prokaryotic or eukaryotic. There are various functions that the cell needs to do to stay alive, and all those functions add up to make an organism alive if it is a multicellular organism. For example, all cells need to be able to absorb, bring in the materials they need to do the various jobs that they have. So things coming in is known as absorption, and then those substances need to be digested or broken down into smaller molecules, and then rearranged into the particular molecule that cell needs by biosynthesis. We've talked about digestion and biosynthesis using hydrolysis as an example of digestion, and dehydration synthesis, an example of biosynthesis, when we were talking about the biological molecules. Along with bringing in those needed molecules to build things inside a cell, we also need energy, because nothing's going to happen without energy. And energy is released through a process known as respiration, or cellular respiration. And energy is going to come from food or from those biological molecules, or particularly from the chemical bonds inside those molecules. All of the metabolic processes that keep a cell alive do produce waste materials, and we need to get rid of the waste. We've got to throw out the trash, and that's known as excretion. And there's various ways that cells get waste materials out. But cells also sometimes make materials that are used by other cells if it's a multicellular organism, or are released into the environment if it's a single-celled organism. And so putting out material that's not exactly waste is known as secretion. So you have excretion for waste and secretion for materials that are not waste. Then cells also have to be able to have movement happen. You have to be able to move things around inside the cell. And of course, a cell like an amoeba can move itself around. And cells are able to sense and respond things in the environment and then adapt and make changes inside. So these are all important cell functions. We're not going to spend a lot of time on all of them, but cells are very busy places. There's a lot going on inside a cell. It is also possible to divide a basic cell into three main sections. There is the cell membrane that goes around the outside of the cell, and this serves as a barrier for protection, holds, what needs to be inside, and keeps anything from the outside getting there. On plant cells and some bacteria cells, you also have a cell wall on the outside of the cell membrane. The cell membrane, because it is the barrier, decides what is going to move in or out of that cell. It is controlling the transportation of substances across the cell membrane. And there's a variety of ways that things transfer across the cell membrane that we're going to look at in a little bit. And the cell membrane also has various mechanisms for communication from one cell to another. This is very important in a multicellular organism, but also single-cell organisms might need to communicate with other cells out in the environment, and so the cell membrane is where that's going to happen. Then another main section of the cell is the inside of the cell, or the cytoplasm. So that's the interior, and it's kind of gel-like, sort of like jello. And that's where you'll find the organelles, the distinct structures that have particular functions and that can be seen. They're wrapped up in an organelle, so you can kind of see their outlines, but they're in the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is also where all those chemical reactions are happening that make up metabolism, and really it's the chemical reactions that are all added together to make up life. And so the cytoplasm is a very important part of the cell because that's where those chemical reactions are happening. Sometimes in sort of the in-between spaces and sometimes in the organelles. But all of that's happening in the cytoplasm. And then the third main area of the cell is where the genetic material is. So if it's a eukaryotic cell, the DNA is held in a nucleus in the center, and it's pretty visible in a microscope. The nucleus is usually the biggest thing in the cell. Or it's coiled up in a nucleoid, as we said, kind of like a plate of spaghetti in a prokaryotic cell. Or sometimes in prokaryotic cells we have plasma, which is another piece of DNA that is formed into a ring. So when we look at any cell, we can always be sure to identify these three parts: where the cell membrane is, where the cytoplasm is, and then where the genetic material is. This is a basic diagram of a prokaryotic cell, sort of a generic prokaryotic cell, pointing out sort of the key structures. So here in the center we have the nucleoid. As I said, the DNA just kind of loosely coiled and piled here in the center. And then around it is the cytoplasm. And in prokaryotic cells, because the only organelle they have is ribosomes, which are these little circles, all of the chemical reactions of metabolism are going to be happening in the cytoplasm. Sometimes some of them happen in this section of the cell membrane that kind of sticks in over here, that's known as the mesosome. Excuse me. So your cell membrane is going to be encasing the cytoplasm, holding everything together all the way around. Plasma membrane is another word for cell membrane, and it happens to be the ones using on these diagrams that I found, but it means the same thing. On some prokaryotic cells outside of the cell membrane, there is a cell wall, another layer of protection, and sometimes beyond that, there's another layer called a capsule. So some of these reason bacteria are so tough is that they are wrapped up in several layers of protective material. Some kind of bacteria can also move themselves around, and that's because they have a sort of a swirling tail that can whip back and forth and move them, and that's known as a flagellum. So this particular diagram is showing a flagellum on the bacteria. You may have heard some of the names of bacteria, and the bacterial names often give hints about the shape of the prokaryotic cell itself. So something that is a bacillus, like a lactobacillus bacteria that is used to make yogurt, is rod-like or capsule shaped. So the picture down here, the bacillus bacteria are in the center. These yellow ones are a bacillus shape. A coccus bacteria is a spherical, so the purple ones here on the left are showing you the coccus shaped. And then the third common shape is a spiral shape, and so you can see our spiraling bacteria on the right. There are a couple other shapes, but they don't have such unique names. But bacteria there's a variety of bacteria that come in different shapes. And then other parts of their names tell you how the cells group together. So diplo tells you that they come in groups of 2 cells, strepto coming as a chain, and staphylo as clustered together, kind of like a bunch of grapes. So if you've ever had strep throat and you've had Streptococcus aureus bacteria in your throat, the strepto tells you that those bacteria form together in a chain. So, if we looked at them under the microscope, they'd be making these long kind of round chains because it's Streptococcus. So coccus is spherical, and that's how the bacteria would appear if we looked at them under a microscope. Staphylococcus causes a staph infection, and again, you would have things clustered together, so a lot of bacteria right on top of each other as a distinctive way that bacteria organizes itself. So that's just a little bit of help in interpreting bacteria names in case you ever wondered as to how those names were put together. Now, cells are very busy places, and there's a lot of processes that are going on inside cells. We're only going to be talking about a few of them this year, and so I just wanted to highlight kind of the big 3 and point out some of the organelles and the processes that we're going to be talking about. The first one we're going to discuss is how energy is captured by cells and then released. Because, of course, without energy, we're not going to have life, because energy is needed to do movement, and if things can't move, you can't be alive. The energy is captured through a process known as photosynthesis, and that happens inside the chloroplast of plant cells. Plants are able to capture the energy from sunlight and store it in glucose. Glucose, of course, becomes food. And then all cells can release that energy. Eukaryotic cells use mitochondria to release that energy from the glucose through a process known as cellular respiration. Protein synthesis is another major process that we're going to be talking about because proteins are so important for life. Not only do proteins provide the structure for animal cells and animal bodies, but also proteins are enzymes, or enzymes are proteins, and enzymes, remember, speed up chemical reactions, and if we didn't have chemical reactions happening, we would not have life. So in protein synthesis, we'll be focusing on the nucleus, which is where the genetic information of the DNA provides the blueprints for how the various proteins are made. The proteins themselves are assembled at the ribosomes, and so that's probably why bacteria and prokaryotic cells have ribosomes as one of the few organelle structures, because that's where proteins are being made, and proteins are really important. But proteins made at the ribosomes are not quite finished yet, and so in eukaryotic cells they get sent off to another organelle called the Golgi body, which adjusts and packages that protein so they'll be ready for whatever their particular job is. And then the third cellular process we're going to talk about is cell division, which is when one cell becomes 2 or many, many more. And so the major organelles we'll hear about in cell division is, of course, the nucleus, because you have to have a copy of that genetic material in order to keep the new cell exactly like the old cell. And then you have spindle fibers. Inside the cell, there's a skeleton almost inside the cell of various protein fibers that provide a framework. It's kind of like the trusses inside a building or a bridge. And they're made out of protein and spindle fibers. We're going to hear about those particular proteins that move things around as cells are dividing. As one cell is dividing itself in two, it has to move copies of the DNA to both sides and maybe copies of particular organelles, and so that's all handled by spindle fibers. So as we go through each one of these processes, as we move through this course, we'll be coming back to the cell and back to the key organelles that are involved in these processes. So I'm going to finish this video by looking at two more diagrams and just pointing out some of the main structures. These diagrams are just sort of generic diagrams of your typical animal cell, and then we'll get to a typical plant cell. We'll be looking at some actual cells, and you'll see they won't be quite as easy to navigate, but this gives you some idea of what to look for. In the cells that we see under our microscopes, we'll be able to point out basically three main parts in our animal cell, those three main sections. You'll be able to see the cell membrane because that's going to be the outer boundary of the cell. And so that's easy to pick out. And of course here it's called, again, plasma membrane. You'll be able to see the nucleus because it's going to be this big spot, usually darker, in the center of the cell or close to the center. And then of course the cytoplasm, everything in the middle, in between, is going to be the third section. So on any slide that you see that I ask you to label, those three main sections need to be labeled. The other parts of the cell are not able to be seen very well under the light microscope. You need an electron microscope, and that's more advanced than what we have at school, but we'll be looking at pictures and diagrams to help you understand. Some of the organelles we've already talked about, ribosomes, which are just small little, you can't even really see them as dots here on this folds of membrane known as the endoplasmic reticulum. Ribosomes involved in protein synthesis. Mitochondria over here, sort of this capsule shaped with some folds in the center. That structure, that's where cellular respiration happens and energy is released. The Golgi body, which kind of looks like this sort of swirly, sometimes it looks like a stack of pancakes, and that's where proteins are packaged and adjusted for their particular job. So those are the ones that I mentioned earlier. We'll talk about some of these other organelles as in kind of an overview, but those are the ones that we're going to be working with the most as we move through this course. And then lastly, we have a diagram of a plant cell. Plant cells typically tend to be a little bit more geometric, not always, but often they are, because the cell wall is surrounding the cell membrane. So the cell membrane is going to be kind of glued right to the inside of the cell wall. You're not going to be able to see it distinctly like you can with animal cells unless something happens to the interior of the cytoplasm, but it is running right along side by side. So the cell wall is easy to be seen in a plant cell. You know where to find the cell membrane because it'll be right next to the cell wall. You'll have the nucleus in the center, again, very clear and easy to see for the most part. And the other structure that is usually quite easy to see in plant cells because they're round, they're fairly large size, and they're bright green are your chloroplasts where photosynthesis happens. So they kind of look like little green coins often in the cells. So those are the structures that you will be able to see under your light microscope. But again, all these other organelles are present. Here's the Golgi body again being shown on this diagram, kind of, as I said, like a pile of flattened pancakes. And that's where your proteins are adjusted for their future jobs. Oh, and another structure you often can see on plant cells is sort of this big empty space. It's not really empty, but it's called the vacuole. It's a big storage room, often for water, sometimes for other substances, and that is only found in plant cells, those very large vacuoles. It's one of the ways that plants keep themselves stiff, is that they have these kind of like the water balloons kind of inside their cytoplasm, and as a plant uses up its water in a hot day and it wilts at the end of the day, it's wilting because it's taken the water out of the vacuole and this is shrunk in size and the plant can kind of collapse a little bit. Plant cells will also have mitochondria, just like animal cells, because they need to release energy from glucose using respiration. A mistaken idea many people have, and you even hear it in some kids' science videos, is that plants use carbon dioxide and animals use oxygen. Well, plants also need that oxygen to release the energy, and so they will have mitochondria to do that. And of course, the ribosomes for protein synthesis are found in every kind of cell, held all in the cytoplasm and wrapped up in your cell membrane or your plasma membrane. So we'll be working with diagrams in class, practicing identifying these pictures and illustrations of the very parts of the cell. This provides the end of this first overview that introduces you to cells and kind of gives you some of the key information that you will hear again and again as we go through this course.